Today, we're going to talk about Tsutomu Miyazaki, a 26-year-old serial murderer that took his anime obsession to the next level by murdering four young girls in the suburbs of Tokyo, Japan. Before we get started, Miyazaki has several disturbing nicknames that were coined by the public, and they give us a sneak peek into the deplorable acts that he committed. First, the otaku murderer. This is because of his obsession with Japanese otaku culture. And otaku is kind of like the term for hardcore anime enthusiasts. At some point, Miyazaki developed an alter ego, Ratman. This is a self drawn manga persona that he says is to blame for his crimes. And the last two, Human Dracula and the Little Girl Killer. And I'll let you take a wild guess what those mean. So, at the surface, it seems like he grew up in a pretty normal home. There's no reports of his parents abusing him, and they were pretty well to do. However, Miyazaki was tormented by his siblings and by his peers at school. Reports mention that his sisters were totally repulsed by him because he was born with a deformity at his extremities. So he was born with this condition where his wrists were fused to his hands, and this birth defect made it so that he couldn't bend his wrist properly. So he was just really physically awkward, and children at school would mock him and tease him, and he didn't have any friends. As a result, Miyazaki became a loner and spent all of his time watching manga or Japanese comics. And he obsessed over anime characters. The only person that seemed to give Miyazaki any affection was his beloved grandfather. His parents were just too busy with the family business to tend to him, and everyone else just completely rejected him. Eventually, Miyazaki's love for anime grew into a deep, dark infatuation with violent pornography. This wasn't just normal pornography. This is anime that featured young girls, and we're talking really young, being brutally raped, beaten, killed, and even cannibalized. Miyazaki got weirder and weirder and started filming his own sisters while they were getting naked in and out of the shower. Once his sister realized what was happening, she confronted him, and he responded by brutally attacking her in a fit of rage. When his mother came to see what the fuss was about, he then assaulted her as well. Things really began to spiral even more after his grandfather died. The social outcast couldn't bear the pain of losing the only person that seemed to care about him. After his mother found him eating his grandfather's ashes and still livid from learning about his perverted home videos of his naked sisters, his parents kicked him out of the house and forced him to go to college, where he studied to become a phototech. Shortly after is when the murders began. Altogether, Miyazaki killed four little girls ages 4 to 7 years old in a surrounding neighborhood. Miyazaki lured the unsupervised girls away from view. He drove them to the outskirts of town. Then he took naked photographs of them just before strangling them. After killing them, he performed sexual acts with their dead bodies, mutilated the victims, and then continued to sleep next to some of the corpses. Reports say that he even drank some of the girls' blood, and he ate two of the victims' flesh. When he was finished with them, he dumped their bodies in nearby parks and wooded areas, but not before taking home souvenirs with him. Some of the girls he kept their clothing, other girls he kept pieces of their body, like their hands. At this point, the police were aware that someone was out there stalking and killing young girls. Miyazaki sent letters to the media under a woman's name claiming responsibility for the crimes, and he sent a box containing the remains of a slaughtered girl to her family. But the police were not sure who the killer on the loose was. Miyazaki was undetected until he was captured in the act. On July 23, 1989, Miyazaki went to a park and began to stalk two young sisters. He approached the young girls and persuaded one of them to come with him while the other ran home to get help. In the midst of his crime, the girl's father stopped Miyazaki while taking nude photos and molesting the girl at the park. Miyazaki was caught by the police while trying to flee to his car. They were unaware that this was the killer that was responsible for the other murders. Upon his arrest, he proudly admitted to the murders. The police then searched his house and found video footage and pictures of his victims, including footage of his own sisters naked in the bathtub. It's presumed that all of Miyazaki's victims have been accounted for. Miyazaki chose his victims based upon the following factors. Availability. These girls were unsupervised, so this allowed for quick, easy access to the victims. Vulnerability. He chose young girls between the ages of 4 and 7 years old because they're not physically able to fight him off and they're easily lured or coerced. Desirability. He clearly developed an attraction to girls that were young from watching violent porn involving this population, and he even admitted this. Miyazaki was motivated by the feeling of power over his victims, and he was fueled by sexual inadequacy. He was incapable of forming normal, intimate relationships with other adults. After his capture, professionals deemed Miyazaki sane, but they diagnosed him as schizophrenic. This is evidenced by his delusions that killing his victims would resurrect his dead grandfather. Miyazaki maintained his innocence. He showed no remorse, and he said that he thought he did a good thing. He was also diagnosed with multiple personality disorder. He believed that his anime alter ego, aka Ratman, a cartoon image of which he drew, committed the crimes. Like other less murderers, he had a buffet of paraphilias going on. Anthropophagy, erotophonophilia, necrophilia, partialism, and pedophilia. The social rejection that Miyazaki endured as a child led to a deep, dark obsession with Japanese hentai, or violent animated porn. As we've learned in this course, frequent exposure to violent pornography can cause some people to grow a tolerance to things that are normally sexually arousing. As the increased sexual aggression builds, fantasies no longer fulfill their desires and they succumb to their deviant visions by carrying out their violent acts. And lastly, Miyazaki shares mixed profile characteristics of serial killers. However, most of his behaviors are considered disorganized. He's messy, he's kind of a loser, he's antisocial, and he's not very calculated. So I'd consider him disorganized, with the exception of him dismembering his victims, and then he disposed of them in different locations. Finally, on April 14th, 1997, Miyazaki was sentenced to death for his crimes. He attempted to appeal in 2006. He tried to say that he was insane, but he lost. He was executed by hanging on June 17th, 2008, at the age of 45 years old. At the time, this case was a media heyday for Japan. Miyazaki's father, the well-known figure within the community, was so embarrassed by his son's actions that he actually killed himself in 1994. Prior to jumping off a bridge, it's reported that he blamed himself for not, quote unquote, raising him right. We have to remember that his father was a newspaper publisher in Japan, and in Japan, the concept of family honor is extremely valued. His father was humiliated by the public, and he felt like he somehow assumed some sort of responsibility for his son's horrific actions. The media was also responsible for damaging the otaku culture. It was now perceived as gross and dangerous, and the widespread community of innocent anime lovers were looked down upon for decades after his murders. Because of language barriers and media fabrications, this case grew to be more and more shocking as it reached the Western world. I found that there have been tons of fictitious elements added to his story just to add shock value. For example, non-reputable websites and a couple of podcasts that I listened to, they mention that Miyazaki was born of incest. They say that his father and sister conceived him. However, there's no evidence that actually is valid. True crime author Joe Turner also publicly debunked this myth. He insists that there was no mention of this during his trial or in court documents. The rumors of incest were just false. Next, we look at photos of his hands. If you were to go and Google Tsutomu Miyazaki right now and look at the images, this creepy photo of vampire or rat-looking hands are tied to his name. Almost every website that I looked at has this image pinned next to his mugshot. As you can see in this photo, it turns out that his hands were completely normal looking. He really only had trouble bending his wrists, so there was nothing visually wrong with his hands or his appearance. It's just that he couldn't function the way that he was supposed to. Miyazaki stated himself that hentai, or violent anime porn, seeded his appetite for raping, killing, and eating young girls. Some may argue that by watching this material, people that would otherwise be pedophiles or violent offenders, they might satisfy their unusual desires by watching this type of porn and therefore abstain from hurting others. This case forces us as a society to look at ourselves and beg the question: does this type of content prevent pedophiles from committing crimes, or does it add fuel to the fire and perpetuate child exploitation? Child porn was legal in Japan up until 1999. Crazy, right? So, in response to this case, a law was finally passed banning the production and distribution of child porn. Just the production and distribution of child porn. However, it wasn't criminally punishable to have it until 2014. This new law does not include the banning of anime that features explicit scenes of children. So that means that violent animated porn featuring really young children is still acceptable. But this doesn't go without a fight. While some people in Japan are still fighting to make this content illegal, lawyers and anime publishers argue that this goes against Japan's free speech and it infringes upon artistic and cultural expression. So, just for fun, I looked further into this issue. And by the way, lolicon is the term used to describe cartoon child porn. And here in the US, I found that lolicon is illegal under the Federal Protect Act. So long as the anime is obscene and it depicts an identical minor engaging in sexual conduct, it's illegal. However, the rules and the level of enforcement and punishment vary from state to state. To wrap things up, I just want to thank you for listening to my presentation. This was kind of a hard one, but I just chose this guy because we had the same birthday and it was a really gross case to cover. But I would just like to pay respect to the four young victims: Mary Kano, Masami Yoshizama, Erika Namba, Ayako Nomoto, and the two unidentified girls that were approached in the park. Thank you for listening.